Thank you for joining the Doctor Whisperer. I am your host, Sharon Feckety, and I am happy to bring you a show where we talk about the business of medicine. I hope that you enjoy it. Please feel free to share, subscribe, and pass it on. Enjoy the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. I'm always so excited when I get the opportunity and the universe kind of brings it to me of having this deep conversation with a physician who quite obviously is passionate about what he does. His name is Dr. Padda. He is a doctor. He's board certified in anesthesiology, addiction, and interventional pain. So for all of you that have been listening or watching, you already know how excited I am about this, because anytime there's an opportunity to talk about the business of medicine and also navigating through mental health, addiction, and recovery, I could talk about this for days. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here. So I want to talk about a little bit first. I'm always interested in the story of why a doctor chooses a particular path. So you were starting to tell me before we hit record, which is sometimes the most interesting of the conversations before we hit record, of why you decided to go into this line of business.
Yeah, so I'll try to make it as short as I can, but the essence of it is that I was born in India. I was born in the northern part of India, right next to the Pakistani border. We were dealing with a lot of war. We were dealing with a lot of issues with civil strife. And I was born in 1964. And I grew up in India in a time when it was experimenting with communism. In order to purchase something, you had to have a chit. A chit is a piece of coupon. So if your family needed to buy a motor scooter, or you needed to get extra rations of XYZ, the government controlled what you could buy. They were experimenting with communism. They had become best friends with the Russians, and they felt that a governmental decision on the appropriate consumption of any material was the right answer. And so that nearly bankrupted the country, and it also created a great deal of strife. Here we were in North India, we produced tons and tons and tons of food, and yet people were starving. They were right here. And the reason why is because there was a mismatch between the production and the consumption. So when my family left North India, we moved to the United States, and I came to the US. I spoke practically no English other than the word bathroom.
Important one.
And we moved, and we moved into the urban core of St. Louis, in basically the ghetto. And you know what? It was an all Black community, and I was the only brown kid with a turban.
Right.
And there was a lot of discrimination. And I didn't realize it. And I couldn't really participate in a lot of the US sports because, one, I didn't know the sports. Two, I didn't know the language. And three, I wasn't very sporty. And so I ended up having to observe. And so what got me into observation was, learning to read and learning to educate myself and experiment. And I tried to figure out how I was going to make money, because you couldn't really, as a little kid, you couldn't really make money. So I started selling door-to-door cards, greeting cards, and quickly figured out that when you sell greeting cards that are customized for particular people's names in the area where I was living, and you sell them up front but don't get the money, and then you go back 2 months into November and give them their cards, one, they might be gone, or two, they don't want those cards anymore. And it's hard to sell greeting cards that are personalized to Lakeisha and to Tyrone when you have to find an exact replacement. So I quickly learned the business aspect of that. Eventually,
how old were you then?
I was probably 10.
On your young entrepreneurial journey.
My first entrepreneurial journey was probably 9 or 10.
Wow, I love it.
And going door to door. And by the time I was 11 or 12, I think almost 13, we moved to the county. And now I was the only brown kid in an all white school, and realizing that, hold on, now I'm an observer, and I've been an observer, and I've been watching all of these things. And so I thought, well, I'm going to have to start my own business. So I started off cutting grass and mowing lawns and doing landscaping. And eventually people asked, hey, would you do this or this or this? So I ended up, by the time I was 15 or 16, having a crew of 7 or 8 people working for me, dropping me off at high school in the morning, and then interacting with me during lunch through the cafeteria phone. And we started doing things like replacing roofs and rehabbing basements. So I got into that entrepreneurial side because I didn't have a lot of access. At that point, there were not a lot of kids that looked like me that were working at McDonald's, which is the typical job that people got. Mm-hmm. And so it was through that hardship and the observation of being an outsider that allowed me to do business skills. But for that, I don't think I would have done it. And I think that hardship really allowed me an opportunity to examine and sit back. And
what about your parents, Doc? What were your parents, and did you have siblings?
My parents, my father was a physicist and my mother was a statistician. So very oriented toward hard science. Yeah. And so I had that science drive because, you could be okay and be really terrible at gym. But if you didn't get honors in science, if you didn't get honors in physics, what were you doing all day? And then at the same time, having started in an impoverished environment and seen what a governmental economy can do, I was really into capitalism. So eventually I got into medical school, excelled in my science fields, and then and moved forward. But I've always had that drive for understanding econometric models and understanding how economies work. Eventually ended up getting an MBA in finance and working in...
You're a real underachiever, Doc.
Well, I did it because I couldn't figure out like econometric models. I did it because I was doing research in pediatric anesthesia and I wanted to figure out cost drivers. And I was like, how am I going to figure out these cost drivers? What's the real cost of healthcare? And why is it that healthcare is so expensive? So I started cutting that up and examining it. And I always want to take the long approach. So I wanted to step back, and I did my degree in international finance because I wanted to see these comparative political systems and these comparative business systems. And I wanted to be able to take a long-term vision, not just like right here, but I wanted to see, hey, what's going to happen as we progress through it. And so, look at the incentive and then figure out the outcome. Look at the incentive, figure out the outcome. And that's what I've spent most of my adult career, is analyzing incentives and outcomes. And so that's what brings me to business. I don't think that you need that necessarily for what we do in medicine, but it certainly gives you a different perspective.
Right. So let me ask you a question. Were you like most physicians, they come out of medical school, they join a hospital or a large practice, and then eventually they realize, I want to practice medicine the way I want to practice medicine, and then they branch out? Or did you go the route of, I was going door to door as a kid, I might as well just start out on my own?
I actually did both at the same time. And so what I did was I went into an academic system to do research. And I wanted to figure this out and be good at basic science research, but I wanted to be clinical. And so I was in pediatric anesthesia first. And at the same time I was doing research, and then I started doing these econometric models. In the background though, I was doing real estate because I'd figured out how to rehab houses and I'd figured out how to rehab buildings. And I'd been doing it since I was, 16. And so my feeling always was that your job is your job and you make income from that. But any surplus income, in order to grow long term, you have to throw it into something that's going to generate wealth. Income is not wealth. Income is simply cash flow. But unless you can take that income and turn it into something passively generating, you didn't do anything. And so my feeling was, take the money that I'm making, that's my engine, that's the engine driving the car, and take all of the excess and throw it into something that's passive that eventually will grow on its own and be bigger than your job. And if you keep doing that consistently, you don't have to worry about your job. And so I'm at a point now where I've done this long enough that I can do about $1.5 million of charity care a year and help my community, which I'm giving back to the community that really took me in at the beginning, which was the urban core, and trying to do everything I can to help. And and being able to essentially donate my services or to radically take care of people that don't have the capacity to even get insurance because they're so far out on the fringe. And so, but then I've still got my wealth creation ongoing as in terms of passive projects. Now, my issue, and this is just personal, everybody has their personal issues. Sure. My issue is that I have bad ADD. Okay. And I know that that's a cop out. That I know people say, oh, I have ADD, that's why I can't succeed. I think ADD is a wonderful force of positivity if you can harness it. It's your secret power, and people don't realize it. But the problem with the secret power is you give somebody who has ADD some amount of intelligence, which most of them are pretty intelligent. You give them some amount of intelligence and you give them some amount of random success, and they don't know what they can't do. And so they typically have shiny object syndrome. They end up flitting around doing 50,000 projects all at the same time. And yeah, it's a classic problem. Yes. So, and so because of that, if you have ADD and you're successful and you can just grunt force yourself through things, you do stupid things. That I've made so many mistakes because I didn't know what I shouldn't be doing. I've owned restaurants. I've owned 5 restaurants, some of the most successful in the area. I do all kinds of crazy projects because I'm curious about them. Sometimes if you have a modicum of intelligence and ADD, you'll do stupid things. Like I designed an entire projectile system, a ground-based projectile system off of the physics, and then hired contractors, independent contractors who were also physicists, to help me do all of the mathematical formulas to put 100 kilogram payload into geostationary orbit for about $25 to $30, and using a slingshot technique. But we designed the whole thing. Of course, it's not practical because of the size that I have to do. But you get these tangential thoughts. You're like, I wonder if that would work. And then before you know it, you're diving deep into a shiny object. And sometimes those things come back and they benefit you later. But those are mistakes that we make. My restaurant division, we did very well. We made tons of money. The nice part about it is I own the buildings and the restaurants. I sold all my restaurants October 2019.
Good time to do that, Doc.
This is and there's a reason for that. Because I have that international finance background, I do a lot of crisis investing. I go into areas that are falling apart. And one of the things I look for is a nitric oxide heat map off of Google. Anytime you see nitric oxide, you know that they're burning bodies. And typically, in my mind, when I was looking at the nitric oxide heat map back in October of 2019, I thought, we own these barbecue restaurants, and there's this huge nitric oxide issue in this area in near Wuhan. They must have a pig outbreak of some virus. And so I talked to my business partner, and she and I were sitting and talking, and I said, if this hits the US, this pig out thing, it's going to be a disaster. The amount of nitric oxide coming out of this is just gigantic.
No way. So you knew this.
Well, I knew that it was nitric oxide. I didn't know it was a virus that was human. I made an assumption that they were burning, because they usually burn animal bodies.
Right.
And so I made the assumption they were burning.
I'm saying like I understand. No, like what?
Yeah.
That's what I should have said. What?
So what they were burning was hospital waste, which also emits nitric oxide. And I didn't know that.
But but you still took that leap of intuition.
Oh yeah. So I took the leap of intuition. And then I purposefully then in January said, by then we'd put the things up for sale. We literally sold everything in the next week and a half. And I kept thinking to myself, I was in Mexico. I'm like, there's more to this story. And it hadn't hit the US yet till March. I said, I'm going to go out to LA and I'm going to go to Chinatown and I'm going to go talk to people there. And so I went out in January to Chinatown and everybody was wearing a mask. And I thought, this is the strangest thing. So I started asking people, and I had to fly in and out of LAX airport, and people getting off the plane at that time were wearing masks. And the international terminal was deserted. People would get off the plane and quickly get out of the airport. And that was totally contrary to what I'd seen in the past. And so that was another affirmation to me that, hey, there's something going on. We just don't know what it is. And then we didn't find out till March.
Wow, that is that's something else, Doc. That is really, I love when anybody listens to, it's like being curious is such an advantage, and really observing and not taking it for granted, right? Like you saw something was happening and you made a move. Most people would just go, it'll be all right. I mean, I remember looking at the news and seeing what was going on and thinking, I'm pretty sure it's going to hit here, but maybe not for a while, you know, so it's amazing. But I want to, with both of us having 8 million ideas and businesses going through our heads, this should be fun. I'm going to bring us back to some of what you're currently doing today in medicine. But I do think it's so important. I've seen with many entrepreneurial doctors, you know, I'm thinking as you're talking about one of my physicians that I work with, who's a psychiatrist, but also an engineer and was a professional skier. So I feel like there's a lot of that, you know, it's like this itch that has to be scratched. There has to be, you have to do it, you know, and the ADD, whether it's diagnosed or not diagnosed, because I don't think I've ever worked with a physician that wasn't, you know, thinking about 17 different ideas or had this crazy habit, you know, or hobby. You know, I had doctors that were serious into motorcycles and others serious into technology. And it's just fascinating to me. So I love listening to you, but I want to get to how now you got into this. So you said pediatric anesthesiology and then addiction and interventional pain. So how did that come about? And I want to make sure that I mentioned too, because I was so excited to hear about how you grew up, because I do think that made such an impact on you. That even though it was probably very difficult, right? My parents are immigrants from Ireland. They spoke the language though, but coming from a different country here, and I grew up in New York. So I was used to diversity. Now I live in Tampa Bay, Florida, not so diverse, you know, so I'm always watching the environment, and I have a great advantage, I feel like, because I have been one of those people. I have been homeless. I have been addicted. I have been in bad situations in my life. So I have a great empathy for others. And when you can use that for good in business, it's magical to watch. Are you still running your medical practice like it's 1990? Well, what about Riva Global Medical Virtual Assistants? A medical virtual assistant, I promise you, is the way to run your medical practice today. Why? Because you can save, I don't know, thousands of dollars. No more paying for health insurance, no more worrying about office space. You also have trained professionals. These wonderful human beings get trained, and they have a client service manager that makes sure that your VA that you're working with for your practice is hitting all the goals that you need to make sure that your practice is run efficiently and friendly. Check out Riva Global Medical Virtual Assistants today.
We interrupt this awesome podcast to share with you about our sponsor, TIE Technology. TIE Technology was founded with the thought that every customer deserves exceptional customer services. So if you know of any company that has a phone system where the auto attendant doesn't really sound good, you press 1 and you think you're going to go to a live person, but you end up with a broken recording, it's probably time that you call TIE Technology. And if you mention this podcast, you will get the first 3 months for free. So make sure you mention the Dr. Whisperer podcast show. Check them out.
So I'm very curious as to the practice that you are currently in. Of course, I'm curious about your real estate as well and flipping. I don't know how you have the time. Are you married? Is your wife going crazy with you?
I am married, and thank God she just leaves me alone.
That's wonderful.
It's a great relationship, because she's a pediatrician and she has no interest in any of this. And, you know, the support that I have is that I'm allowed to do stupid things, because she's from a more conventional kind of family, and it's, you know, she's what I would consider sane. She's normal.
Right.
And I, if I knew somebody like me, I would say, hey, you're not exactly sane. You're trying to do too much, or you're trying, it's not appropriate. But with my kids, I encourage them to do the insane thing, because I think it makes a huge difference. If you can handle the insanity of it, you're going to do really well.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of people can't.
Yeah.
And so,
par for the course of being an entrepreneur, you got to be a little out of your mind to do it.
Yeah, you have to be able to allow yourself to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes constantly. So your question is, where am I now? What do I do now? And how did I get there, as in terms of interventional pain? So I started in the anesthesia world. I was dealing a lot with heart, liver, lung transplant from the anesthesia side. And I ended up happening to run across a bunch of ped-onc patients at the same time. Mm-hmm. And we had a very nice bone marrow transplant unit at Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. But I noticed they had a lot of pain, and it was really untreated. So I started to figure out ways to treat it, and ended up learning a ton about it. And then decided, well, you know what? I should just go ahead and get board certified in this, because I'm anesthesia board certified. I can cross over and do this pediatric pain. I did that. And eventually by then, I was, I'd done a ton of research, and I was starting to burn out on the academic world. The politics I didn't love. So I converted to the private practice world. And I immediately jumped into taking over a couple of anesthesia practices. And I worked with some hospitals, took those over, and grew that. But I was no longer enthralled by anesthesia, and I was more and more attracted to this pain side. So I ended up doing adult pain as well, and then focused in on that. And in that process is where I discovered addiction, and I discovered diabetes reversal, because I found out that almost all of these patients had severe systemic metabolic inflammation. They had the biomarkers for metabolic inflammation, and the underlying milieu was what was a partial trigger. They had abnormal omega-6 to 3 fatty acid ratios. They had high hsCRP. They had all of these biomarkers. And I was trying to figure it out. And then how could it be that people that I was treating who had become financially incapacitated due to pain, how could they be so fat? Like, how was it that these people were overweight, but they didn't have any money? And so it clearly wasn't because they had a ton of money and resources that they were getting overweight. And so I started digging into that and ended up becoming board certified in addiction. And then at the same time, I also ended up learning a ton about nutrition, which they don't teach you anything about in medical school. And so I ended up going down that road and have become a speaker for Low Carb USA and for American Society of Interventional Pain, dealing on nutritional aspects of healthcare, which is really 2/3 of our healthcare expenditure is things of defective nutrition and metabolic inflammation. Now, only 6% of the US population, 6 or 7%, is metabolically healthy. 93 to 94% of the US population is metabolically dysfunctional. And that's a big number. And so, back to my ADD, here I am looking at the population that I'm in. I'm thinking, what's going to happen to this population over time? So I did a little quick study. I took my real estate world and I said, okay, I'm going to geomap these areas around me, and I'm going to look at household income. And then I'm going to combine that with my econometrics of healthcare outcome. And I'm going to do a preliminary study. So I looked at all this and looked at DRG codes and realized that the vast majority of people in a 9 square block area were overweight, and they had all of these comorbidities. So then I hired a statistician. I said, hey, I want you to analyze this. And I have a result that I think is true, but I need independent verification. So it turns out in a 9 square block area of North St. Louis, currently sitting there, analyzing that population, by 2035, 99% of them will be overweight. By 2035, 60% of them will be diabetic type 2. Half of them will go on to end-stage renal disease and be on kidney dialysis by 2035. The cost of care for that population in 9 square blocks exceeds the budget for the state of Missouri by 2035. The disposable budget of Missouri will be spent in 9 square blocks. And so that then provided me the impetus for, well, I can't let this happen to the community that I'm trying to help. So how am I going to reverse that? And that's what got me into my reversing diabetes, because it's easy to do if you approach it correctly.
So tell us a little bit about that approach, because I've worked a lot with doctors that are I've successfully witnessed them reverse diabetes, and everybody I feel like has a different way of doing it. So I'm very interested to find out what your course of action is.
Yeah. So I applied my addiction model to diabetes. So what it is hedonic.
Sugar is more addictive than cocaine.
It's as addictive. But people will substitute. It's called hedonic substitution. And we're driven predominantly by desires. I mean, that's how human beings are. We're driven by the search for pleasure. And we're also driven by the rest of our neurologic system as in terms of neuroinflammation. So it's a combination. The underlying science behind it is that, one, human beings in the United States, they don't move as much as they used to. They simply stopped moving. And so we never deplete the glycogen out of our livers. And so we have about a 2,000 kilocalorie glycogen store in our liver. Every time we eat sugar, we produce insulin. Insulin people think that insulin just simply takes sugar from the bloodstream and shoves it into the cells. Insulin preferentially takes the sugar from our bloodstream and shoves it into fat storage. It first shoves it into glycogen and then shoves it into fat storage. Your total volume that you can store of glycogen is 2,000 kilocalories. And so if you never deplete the glycogen in your liver and you eat 6 or 7 times a day and you have high insulin, every time you eat, you're making a fat storage. And that's, so one, it's stop eating all the time. 2, let's stop eating the sugar. And then 3, let's make you more insulin sensitive. And let's clean up your brain. So what's making insulin resistance? Well, certainly it's the high insulin, which makes your receptors insulin resistant, but also it's the actual fluidity of the cells. If the cells are no longer fluid, all of the receptors don't work. The ones in your brain, the ones in your liver, the ones in your muscle. And so that's a function of omega-6 to 3 fatty acid ratio. That's vegetable oil. Most of our obesity epidemic started in about 1971, right when we converted over to a ton of vegetable oil consumption. And it's driven by that excessive vegetable oil. Our ratios are way off. It used to be that the majority of our omega-3s, most of our oil was a balance of omega-3 and omega-6. And now most of our oil, 15-to-1 ratio, is omega-6. So I get patients to do the simple stuff first and then try to work on their hedonic substitution and try to deplete their glycogen stores. So time-restricted nutrition, eat in a narrow window so that you actually empty some of the glycogen. Simple activity, simple as walking, will deplete some of the glycogen. And then get away from the carbohydrates. You don't need any. Sugar is not an essential external issue. We don't need that. We need certain fatty acids. We need certain amino acids. We need certain proteins, but we don't need sugar. Your body, through gluconeogenesis, can make most of the sugar it needs. So you really don't need to consume. And right now, most people, they're getting like almost a half a cup of sugar extra a day. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So we changed that.
I have so many thoughts about this because I always hear something different. So it becomes very confusing about what we are supposed to eat and what we're not supposed to eat and what's good and what's bad and how it can, I think more so for a woman like myself, really screw somebody up when they're constantly thinking about which food to eat and what is healthy and what is unhealthy. As soon as you say sugar, I think pineapple. I don't think donut. I think carrots. Where am I going to take some of that sugar out of my diet? Because there's been so many throughout my life. So now that I'm turning 50 and listening more than I am acting upon everything that I'm suggested to do, I'm fascinated by what you're saying, because, some carbs are good, some carbs are bad. You're saying no carbs. So anyway, I am just It is just at a point, I feel like there's so much overwhelming information out there. And I think a lot more so sometimes for women and addicts. So I like the crossroad of how you are dealing with nutrition, because you nailed it when you said, of course, you know, doctors, just like doctors aren't taught business, you're not taught about nutrition. There's not a lot of background about addiction unless you specialize. So I think that a lot of people go to certain physicians thinking like they're going to go to their primary care because they're depressed. Not always a great idea. Good idea, you go to your doctor, but maybe, you know, somebody that specializes in that is a better deal, better road. But I feel like I need to do a part 2 with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I feel like. I feel like I have not had enough time to dissect all of this and really also help those physicians and practice administrators that might be listening to the show because of the business of medicine. So before I let you go today, I want to ask you, how does your practice run? I'm a firm believer, because I used to run practices from New York to Tampa Bay. I've had pediatrics, adult medicine. I've run the gamut. And today I feel so differently about how a practice should run. But it's very personal, especially when you're an entrepreneur. I love nothing more than referring out virtual assistants to help, because hospitality and healthcare is depleting. And I think because you care so much, and that's obvious, you've taken a lot of time to give back to your community. You've said that more than once, that I would feel really good about telling people to go to your practice, because that's where you come from. It's evident. You speak from the heart. So what does, briefly, and then, like I said, I'd like to do a part 2 because I don't want to take you away from seeing your patients. What does your practice currently look like?
So it's an interesting practice as in terms of the technology that I apply. As in terms of the human contact, it's a direct practice because I'm interventional.
Right.
And we specialize in doing injections and doing surgery and directly intervening. Now, so when that type of practice is there, and when you're at the edge of addiction, you're bringing people in who have addiction, you need a lot of contact with them. Mm-hmm. It takes 14 attempts for somebody to stop smoking. Mm-hmm. It takes about 20 attempts for them to change their diet. It takes a multitude of attempts, but not as many, to get off of opiates. Mm-hmm. And so you're bringing in patients that are on very high morphine equivalents. You know, the average patient coming into me on a new patient consult is on 300 to 400 milligrams of morphine equivalent. And they've had failed back surgery. They may have had something else, and they've been upregulated. Right. They have become pain refugees from their primary care because the primary care says, look, I can't really deal with this anymore. The DEA is going to come get me and I'm going to be in trouble. So I'm going to move you to an interventionalist. So my goal is to reset and reformat the patient's preoccupation with their narcotics, and at the same time fix the neuroinflammation in their head. So that's the one-on-one component. But at the same time, you have to leverage technology. So I have an entire call service that I developed in the Philippines that does all of my initial phone contact. They take all of the patient information, stick it into our systems, and they do all of the immediate follow-up. And then at the same time, we have an email system and we have a text system that contacts the patient. At the same time, we have our virtual psychologist who reaches out to the patient on nearly a weekly basis. A lot of it you can't charge for, but you need to be able to have that remote patient contact, because if you don't, the patient will fall off the wagon. If you don't have the psychological support, I don't care how good of an injection I've done, it's going to be a failure. Right. And if I don't have that support that says, hey, it's a coaching system, and you have to coach these patients and also recognize that they live in a paradigm of other things. So if I'm in there talking to Bessie or Jackie or whoever it is, and I know that she's morbidly obese, and I know that she has terrible pain and can't walk and can't work, I also know at that very moment that her family is probably morbidly obese. And if I change her, the family is going to pull her right back because of the food that they all eat. So you have to have when you're treating the patient, you're treating the family unit.
Yeah.
And then you expand from the family unit to their relevant other social structures like churches. And so because I'm in the African-American community, I'm spending a lot of time doing outreach to the local churches to get them to understand where we need to go. And because I can communicate in an appropriate way, I can show them the issues associated with what big food and what big agriculture has done to the community. And because I'm not approaching it with my hand out saying, give me something, I'm approaching it instead with, hey, this could help your community. Then they accept that information. They're used to everybody coming to them, begging them for a vote and not helping them. They're used to everybody coming to them and demanding something from them, their vouchers or whatever, but then never doing anything. So my feeling is, look, I'm going to engage the community and I'm going to do it in a paradigm mode. I'm going to do it in a global way. And then the individual elements of that community will come together and allow me to help. And so it's a more global approach, but you have to virtualize everything you can in order to create leverage. And leverage is the key in healthcare. That's what we're missing. It allows me to have systems to teach. I record videos for my patients and say, okay, look, I'm not going to repeat the same 12 words or the 500 words that I just did to the other 5 patients. I'm going to virtualize this. And I'm going to tell you, okay, here's what you need to listen to. And then when you have questions after you've listened to it, then come back to me. Yeah. And then let's talk about it, because we can't spend all of our time answering the same 12 questions or 20 questions. So you come up with systems to answer those.
Yeah, well, it also, so much burnout happens because it's, repetitive. And if you don't have a passion anymore for what you're doing, you get burnt out, and technology allows an opportunity to keep everybody that is practicing medicine engaged and excited. And the fact that you collaborate with psychologists and community is everything, because it's never going to be one thing. Everybody says, Sharon, where do I go? What doctor do I see? I'm like, okay, well, you could go to this doctor, but remember, like walking outside and meditation, all these other things, how you eat, what you see every day, your environment, it's all so important. So I appreciate the fact that you have been so collaborative, and I would love to have you back again. So everybody tune in for Dr. Padda on part 2 in the near future, but thank you so much for all that you're doing to help others.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So if you want to party like it's 1999, but run your medical practice like it's 2022, don't forget to check out Reva Global Medical Virtual Assistants. So don't forget, if you mention that you've seen the show or listened to it on the podcast, mention Thai Technology and you will get 3 months for free.